Don't let the UFC fool you into thinking that they care about Tony Ferguson. They don't care about his future. They don't care about his health. And they certainly don't respect him. Dana White and the UFC have no integrity when it comes to fighter safety, fighter health, and of course, they don't give a goddamn about Tony Ferguson because they set him up with Paddy Pimblett and they want him to lose his fight this December at UFC 296. I'm not going to get into the prediction or what I think is going to happen in the fight. That's not what I'm here to discuss. I don't even think that this is a one-sided matchup. I think it'll be a competitive fight. What I'm here to discuss is the fact that Tony Ferguson is still fighting and that he's not only still fighting after taking 6 losses in a row and getting the absolute shit beat out of him by Bobby Green, and before that, losing to Nate Diaz, taking damage, and before that, getting knocked out cold by Michael Chandler, before that, getting dominated twice by 2 grapplers, and before that, getting absolutely destroyed by Justin Gaethje. It's not just that he's still fighting, it's that the UFC is setting up Tony Ferguson to lose against Paddy Pimblett. This is the classic, old fighter being used as a stepping stone against the guy that still has some juice in him, that still has potential to be a big star. I know that people think that Paddy Pimblett is done and all this. He's still young. The UFC wants him to do well because he's a big name. They know that Tony Ferguson's days of winning and being a contender are completely and utterly done. Now, why do I say that the UFC has no integrity? Why do I say that this is so disgusting? It's an abomination is what it actually is. Dana White is the same guy that criticized Oscar De La Hoya for putting together a fight between Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell just a few years ago when Chuck Liddell was in his 50s and Tito Ortiz was in his late 40s. I understand that Tony Ferguson is not in his late 40s. He's not in his 50s. He's 38 years old. 39 years old. He's going to be turning 40. He will be 2 months away from being 40 years old when he fights Paddy Pimblett. I get it, different age groups, but it's about the principle. This is what I'm getting at. Dana White at one time called the matchup between Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell disgusting. All right? And not only did he say it was disgusting, I'm going to read you guys an exact quote that Dana White said leading up to that fight. This is the quote from Dana White. I've been friends with Chuck Liddell for 20 years, and the reality is that Chuck Liddell retired when he should have retired 8 or 9 years ago. And Chuck Liddell's almost 50 years old and has no business fighting anymore. And the fact that the state of California even let this fight happen is disgusting. Dana White didn't fault Chuck Liddell for wanting to fight and was shocked that the UFC Hall of Famer allowed himself to be talked into the stupid fight. Okay, so once again, Dana White was angry at Chuck Liddell for even allowing himself to be talked into this. I understand the frustration, but he's not shocked that this guy would want to fight. I'm not shocked that Tony Ferguson wants to fight. This is who he is. His identity is a fighter, a high-level fighter. It's hard to let go. I understand it. But it's just the fact that if you understand that it's wrong for Tony Ferguson to be fighting at this point and you realize that it's time for him to hang it up, for goodness sakes, this man is unbelievably brain damaged. And you know it too if you've heard about the stories that have gone on surrounding Tony Ferguson behind the scenes throughout the past few years. Tony Ferguson has been dealing with the devastating effects of getting brain damage, and we're just making it worse. And let me get back to the Dana White quote. Chuck's a grown man and can do whatever he wants to do. But that's when the state of California, that's when the promotion has to step in and save him from himself. This is what I mean. This is what I'm talking about. They will use this man for every single last bit of relevancy that he has until he is a vegetable. And I mean this. They don't give a fuck. Dana White is the guy that is promoting this fight. Dana White is the guy that wants Tony Ferguson to keep fighting as long as he still has a delusional fan base that are going to root for him. A delusional fan base that is going to want to see Tony Ferguson no matter what. This is the issue. The UFC can get away with this because fans are blindsided by their curiosity of the sport. And what I mean by this curiosity, I'm talking about the fans that are getting too deeply into the nitty-gritty details about the X's and O's on the fight. Oh, well, Paddy Pimblett's grappling and Tony Ferguson's this and that. I understand that the fight is going to happen and that eventually we're going to break this stuff down, but I don't even think this should be of concern. Like, if your first thought about this fight is, oh man, I can't wait for this matchup, I don't know what to tell you, man, but it's time to wake the fuck up. Tony Ferguson's career is done, all right? I'm not interested in this matchup, my man. I don't give a fuck about the matchup itself. He's over. I don't like this mindset of, oh, if Tony Ferguson can pull this off, I really like how that opens up this new path for him. Stop. This is the exact kind of mindset that the UFC is preying on so that they can get away with allowing this motherfucker to fight. And they don't understand that every single beating that he takes is just pushing him further and further towards the edge of no longer being able to live a life that is somewhat healthy. Tony Ferguson's not going to be living a healthy life 10 years from now, 15 years from now. It's going to be bad for him no matter what, after all the damage that he's taken. But think about every single extra fight that you add on to this is going to make it much, much worse. Even if Paddy Pimblett beats Tony Ferguson, this ain't going to be the end. Tony Ferguson is a man that needs to be saved from himself. Tony Ferguson is a guy that is willing to do whatever it takes to continue to get into the cage time and time and time again. Are we just going to let Tony Ferguson fight up until he's no longer able to walk? Are we going to let Tony Ferguson fight up until he's slurring his words? Is that when Tony Ferguson's going to retire? I don't understand what the end game is here. And this is what I'm getting at. The UFC has said this about Chuck Liddell. They've said the California Athletic Commission, Oscar De La Hoya, were disgusting for sanctioning this fight. You're doing the same thing with all of your legends. Dana White and the UFC are constantly sanctioning fights between young, hungry, up-and-coming fighters and their old, washed-up legends. And I hate to break it to some of you guys that may be delusional about Tony Ferguson's career. I think 90% of us that have the ability to clearly think about this matter would agree that Tony Ferguson is washed up and would agree that the UFC constantly glorifies retirement fights for the purpose of using their old fighters, these old legends, as stepping stones and to drain them like bottles of toothpaste down to the last drop, just to use their fighters until they're no longer relevant, and so they kick them to the curb. And yet they have the fucking nerve to tell us that they care about fighter safety and fighter health. You're putting your legends up against young and up-and-coming killers that their backs are against the wall and they have no other choice but to go out there and make it a point to put a statement on and finish these older guys so that they aren't looked at as young bums that weren't able to finish an old man. You understand what I'm saying? Paddy Pimblett isn't a young up-and-coming killer. He's young. He's not an up-and-coming killer, but he does have his back up against the wall. And he is a guy that understands that he needs to go out there and put a statement on. He can't have this close fight with Tony Ferguson. And let's not even talk about the outcome necessarily of what I think is going to happen, because I actually think it's going to be a close fight. And I think it's going to be somewhat of a scrap. That's not what I'm here to discuss today. What I'm here to discuss is the fact that it's not the last one for Tony. If you were to think about a perfect retirement fight for Tony Ferguson, you'd probably be thinking that the Nate Diaz fight was a good time to hang it up. Tony Ferguson coming off of a devastating KO loss to Michael Chandler and then fighting Nate Diaz. Yes, he lost that fight, but it was a good, close back and forth. You know, this is the kind of nostalgia that the fans sometimes like to see. Was that not enough? Did you need to see Tony Ferguson get the shit beat out of him by Bobby Green? Did you need to see him get bullied into a submission? This is kind of what I'm getting at. When are the fans that get hyped up for Tony Ferguson going to have enough with seeing this guy in the octagon? He's not the same person that was at the top years ago. You understand this. You want to feel a little bit of nostalgia. Haven't you got enough? Didn't you understand that the old man Tony Ferguson was present against Nate Diaz? Didn't you understand that the old man Tony Ferguson that's unbelievably brain damaged was in there against a guy like Bobby Green? How much damage do you need to see this man take before your selfish desires can finally be quenched to want to see him in the cage? I understand that there are Tony Ferguson fans out there. If you actually cared about this guy, you wouldn't want him to be fighting anymore. You know deep down inside that it's best for him to hang it up. I know a fighter wants to fight. This is his choice at the end of the day. But it doesn't mean you have to enable dangerous behavior. It doesn't mean you have to promote Tony Ferguson's behavior to want to put himself in harm's way time and time again when he's delusional about it. when he can't accept reality that he's done, he's declined. He no longer is a guy that's ever going to be competitive at a high level, and that's just the fucking facts. We don't need to pamper him. We don't need to tell Tony Ferguson, you're so great, you're so amazing, man. You still have it in you just to be nice. You need to at least have, some basic human decency to tell Tony Ferguson the truth. And I think that it's the UFC's responsibility at some point to step in and be that body that shuts it down. I think it's important for Dana White to be the guy that says, you know what? Tony Ferguson's still relevant. You know what? He still has somewhat of a name, but he's taken too much damage. He's never going to be competitive. We know his best days are beyond gone. Not even his best days. Somewhat of his mediocre days are beyond gone. We aren't going to let this guy fight. We're not going to promote a guy like Tony Ferguson to fight anymore because it's just too bad for the man. It's too devastating for his health. He has a family. He has kids. You need to save this man from himself. I'm worried that it's going to get to the point to where after this fight, let's say Tony Ferguson loses, for example, they're going to give him a Jim Miller fight. They're going to give him a retirement fight on UFC 300. And that's just one too many. There's already been one too many fights as it is. Let's say he wins. Because listen, let me just say this. As a fan, I need to make this distinction. As a fan, I want Tony Ferguson to win. I want to be happy for him. I want him to get the job done. And I don't want him to lose. I'm not rooting for him to lose. I don't want Tony Ferguson to fight to begin with. If the fight's actually going to be happening, I want him to win. All right? I would be lovely to see Tony Ferguson win. I'll be rooting for him. But if he wins is what I'm talking about. He'll get a bump up. He will get a bump up in competition. He'll fight a younger guy. Or he'll fight someone that's still better than Paddy Pimblett that's just too dangerous for him to overcome. He'll be in his 40s. He'll probably lose that. And then he'll fight again. We'll have 3 more fights. It's either 2 or 3. Fuck, it might even be 4. And this is what I'm getting at. Like, Tony Ferguson shouldn't have 4 more fucking fights, man. I don't care if you're a fan of the sport, bro. It's time to criticize and to push back on this behavior from the UFC. It's absolutely disrespectful to use their legends as stepping stones to build up younger guys. You know they want Tony Ferguson to lose, which makes it even that much more fucked up. I don't want Tony to lose. A lot of you don't want Tony to lose. Most people outside of Paddy Pimblett's family is rooting for Tony Ferguson, but you know goddamn well the UFC wants Tony Ferguson to lose because Paddy Pimblett, as I said, is still young and he still has some energy left in his career. He's still got some gas. He's still got some fuel. And it's all bullshit. So that's all I wanted to rant about today. I think it's disgusting that they're putting this matchup together. And I didn't even mention Dana's quote about Tony looking awesome the other day. He was mentioning in an interview the other day that Tony Ferguson looked great. Tony Ferguson looked awesome in his last fight against Bobby Green. He should be ashamed of saying that. What do you guys think about this? I'm not even saying that Tony Ferguson's going to lose. I'm just saying even if he wins, he'll get a bump up. He'll lose that probably. He'll fight again in a retirement fight, or maybe he'll fight 2 more times. Him winning might even be worse in the long run for his health than him losing, because if he loses, they might only give him 1 more fight. And as I said, 1 more fight, that's still too many fights. He should have called it quits after the Nate Diaz fight. He should have called it quits after the Bobby Green fight. The UFC should be ashamed of themselves for allowing this fight to happen, and Dana White especially. And he has no integrity because he criticized the same thing happening with Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Until next time.